Morning. I'm Sharon Squassoni. I direct the Proliferation Prevention Program here at CSIS. Thank you all for coming. It is my great pleasure to introduce Cindy Vestergaard, who will be speaking today on uranium is not just a rock. We're going to talk about Arctic Yellowcake today, which is particularly timely in the wake of the elections in Greenland. Cindy is here from the Danish Institute for International Studies for 6 months as a visiting fellow in the Proliferation Prevention Program. And the Danish Institute for International Studies is an independent research institute that is financed primarily by the Danish state, and they do research and analysis primarily on globalization, security, and development. And they are co-hosting this meeting today. So Cindy is here. We're collaborating on a project that's being funded by the MacArthur Foundation on uranium governance. And she'll be here for 6 months, and we'll have another workshop, I believe in May or June, on some issues related to uranium governance in the United States. So if you're interested in that, we'll invite you to that. So Cindy has a PhD from the University of Copenhagen. She's done a lot of work in all kinds of weapons of mass destruction, and she's had a peripatetic academic career. She started out at the University of British Columbia and then got her master's degree at the Central European University in Budapest, Hungary, and finally her PhD from the University of Copenhagen. She has government experience, having worked in the Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, and we are totally thrilled that she's here at CIS.
Thank you so much. I don't think I've ever had my academic career called peripatetic before.
Peripatetic.
Oh, thank you.
That's a compliment.
Yes. Is this too loud, or is it okay? Can you all hear me okay? Usually, thank you so much for having me, and usually the world's largest island actually does not get that much attention. So I'm glad that you're all here today, and particularly a welcome to our online audience as well. Hi, Denmark, and hi, Greenland. Looking at, I think the best thing to do, I'll go over the history when I talk about what I mean when I talk about the Kingdom of Denmark, and then we'll zero in on Greenland and also the kingdom's nuclear or non-nuclear history before zeroing in specifically on uranium and the current policy debate that currently is guiding the issue here. So, and I will walk a little. So in terms of the kingdom, what we mean is the 3 dots, one larger than the other 2, up on the map. So Greenland actually is the world's largest island. It is over 2.1 million square kilometers, which is about over 836 square miles, so 3 times the size of Texas. On that island is just under 57,000 people. So it is actually one of the least densely populated countries in the world, and we do refer to Greenland as a country. I think it's 0.026 people per square kilometer, so if you need some elbow room, that's the place to go. It also has the world's 2nd largest ice cap. So after Antarctica, this is a permanent ice frost that we have up there. The Faroe Islands is the little dot just above northern Scotland, and between that and Iceland. And that also is teeny tiny. That is about, I think, 1,400 square kilometers, or about 8 times the size of DC. So you can see even the juxtaposition between the islands. And then Denmark itself is over 43,000 square kilometers, I think. And that's about just a little bit less than twice the size of Massachusetts. And in Denmark, we have 5.5 million people. Faroe Islands, we have, I think it's 50,000. Yes. So just to get a sense of what we're talking about, the kingdom as a whole, if you're looking at geography, including Greenland, it's quite large. When we're talking about population, it's under 5.6 million people in total. And of course, it's Greenland that we're specifically interested in here. And as you can see, the ice cap. And not surprisingly, most of the population lives around the coast. And fishing is about over 80% of its current exports. At the moment, about 10% is metals. And it is the southern part that we're going to be focusing on mostly, Kvanefjeld, which has the big mine that has been explored. And when we're looking at the economic breakdown of the island itself, its GDP is actually quite similar to other EU economies, but it is highly subsidized by Danish subsidies, which is about 3.3 billion krona a year, or around $600 million a year. So that actually makes up 60% currently of government revenues in Greenland. The new Tax and Welfare Commission that was just established in Greenland actually says that the disparity between rich and poor is quite high, and actually even higher than the average OECD numbers. So the issues that were on the election over the past couple weeks were definitely poverty, education, and then mining. And as obviously it's the issue of trying to wean itself off the Danish subsidies and eventually push for independence. Greenland was actually a colony up until 1953, when an amendment to the Danish constitution included it as a constituency alongside the Faroe Islands. And then in 1978, they got home rule. And then in 2009, they actually took home more authorities under the Self-Government Act. And that's what actually gave them full authorities over their natural resources. But let's talk about the non-nuclear history of Denmark. And you all know this man mostly. It's Niels Bohr. And a picture with him of Einstein. I love that picture. I was actually hoping to get a picture with both of them smoking the pipe, because they like to do that. And Niels Bohr has been called a man that was weighed down with a conscience. He is one of the key researchers when it comes to fission. And he actually, and I have some great quotes here from him. He was one of the ones that, and James, you actually might be able to help me out on here on this when it comes to Niels Bohr. He was one who had determined, I think it was 1939, the rare isotope U-235 could actually split, and it was what was fissionable. But he also didn't believe that it could be separated easily enough to be able to actually make a bomb. And he's quoted as saying, it would take the entire efforts of a country to make a bomb. In 1939, he was actually also in Washington, and he was the one to bring the news to the U.S. of an experiment in Germany that actually was able, a successful uranium fission experiment. That was the first. Then in 1942, when the Nazis were coming in and arresting the Jewish population, he fled, went to Sweden, and then went to the UK. And that's where Winston Churchill and his group actually informed him of the Manhattan Project, and then realized actually it can take a nation to make the bomb. Then he was in Los Alamos by December 1943. And they called him the scientific father confessor. So he actually did help with issues in terms of problems with the atomic bomb, but from his perspective and his primary concern was to mitigate a nuclear arms race. And that really was his focus from there on in. And he was quoted as saying that, this is why I went to America. They didn't need my help in making the bomb. And then actually post-war, this is very much what he focused on, was his message was one of scientific openness, that anything to do with the research on nuclear fission and nuclear weapons should be made publicly available, and it should also be under international control. And that's really where, when he went back to Denmark, that was what would become also part of the whole Danish history in general. And Denmark actually really is one of the most non-nuclear of the NATO alliance, if I can put it that way. It is one of the first, if not the oldest, legislation out there on radioactive sources. It's only been amended a few times since 1953. Denmark actually knows where all of its 11,000 radioactive sources are, real time. It's been calling for verifiable cessation of nuclear testing since the 50s. As you can imagine, with Nova Zemlya right up north, every time there would be an explosion in that area, the Danes would certainly react. And then in 1957, Hans Christian Hansen had, the prime minister at the time, had actually declared that Denmark was a nuclear weapons-free zone during peacetime. So it would not store nuclear weapons or allow their transfer through Denmark. And this is going to get a little bit tricky in the next slide, though, actually, what that meant. And actually, Denmark, a little known fact, was that it was the 4th country in the world to ratify the NPT. So it's usually right in there when it comes to anything on the non-nuclear side. And in 1985, there was a parliamentary resolution that there would be no indigenous nuclear power program within the country. That said, 10% of the current energy actually does come from nuclear from Sweden and from Germany. The 3 research reactors that were started in the 50s have been closed, all of them. 2 have actually been decommissioned, and the 3rd is, should have been on its way to starting to be decommissioned last year, should be done by 2018. So in many respects, it's not surprising that NTI had ranked Denmark, given it a score of 100, and ranked it first in terms of a non-nuclear weapon state and using, or a country without nuclear materials. It really has foregone the nuclear fuel cycle and only engages in radioactive or nuclear technology for medical purposes. But of course, this has been hard to reconcile when you are part of a nuclear alliance and you actually buy into a nuclear deterrence. And this has particularly been prevalent and has been called a double policy since 1968, when Hansen's declaration in 1957 was really tested. So in 1968, this is the Tula Air Base. This is the most northern air base that the United States has. It's not the most northern base in the world, though. That's Alert in Canada. I think it's about 550 miles from the North Pole, and it is in the top western part of Greenland. And they actually paint the landing strip white to actually reflect the sun, so that they can actually land, particularly in the summer. I don't know how it works in the winter, Sharon. I don't know how they can find find the whiteness against the whiteness. And in 1968, 4 bombs went, or a bomber crashed into the ice off Tula. And 4 bombs were on that, and obviously there was a major cleanup that had to happen from that. At the time, both the Danish and the American government said that it was not a routine flight, that it was an emergency landing. And what ended up happening, though, was in 1995, we ended up having Tulagate, when a whole bunch of documents came up that actually this was part of the 24/7 airborne alert system. So Greenland constantly had a bomber over the radar 24/7, and then there were also two other planes that would go over from South Europe up to the northern part over Greenland and the Arctic. And so there were about 12 bombs constantly over Greenland. So when this revelation started to come up, and then also there were declassified documents coming out of the US in the 1990s saying that the Americans actually stored up to 54 nuclear weapons on the base as well. So this is when we talk about a double policy, where there seemed to be a certain policy that was allowed for Denmark, but something different for Greenland. And this, as you can imagine, also had some pretty political sensitivities and tensions between the two. So with Tulagate in 1995, it actually led to a report from the predecessor to the Danish Institute for International Studies, DUPI. They ended up coming up with the conclusions that, yes, there was this double policy, and that many of the Danish officials actually knew about what was going on. It was a very limited few, and then those who got any sense of what was happening would turn their backs. And this also, in many respects, due to legal issues with the base itself and what the legalities of what actually the Americans were allowed to do, which, of course, both sides took differently. Then in 2008, the BBC had done another reporting that actually the 4th bomb had been lost and that it had never been recovered. And Danish Parliament actually commissions another report, and this time from the Danish Institute for International Studies, and that came up with there was no 4th bomb, and no, they were not looking for a bomb. What actually it seems to have been, they lost the spark plug at the bottom of the sea. And the spark plug is important because that's the second trigger, the trigger to the secondary explosion. But also, it's something that the Americans, if they couldn't find it, then they probably thought that the Soviets couldn't. And this picture here is of the ice that they were putting into canisters. And I believe it's Los Alamos, I might be wrong, that actually still has the canisters of which now would be water. 1988, the nuclear elections. This was an interesting case where, because again of Hansen's declaration in 1957, this started to be pushed to the forefront of what about the port calls. So all the submarines and boats that were coming in from the Americans, the French, and the Brits, there was a lot of controversy at that time, and it was maneuvered within political elections as well and within the opposition. And the the port issue actually became very, very divisive. And what ended up happening was that the opposition wanted the government to issue a diplomatic note, essentially, or that any visiting ship should know that Denmark was a country that were a nuclear weapons-free zone. It would not allow nuclear weapons in its harbors or in its territory. This was quite divisive, and NATO actually was very loud about this at the time. There was a NATO nuclear planning group that was meant to be scheduled for, I think it was in Aarhus or in Kolding, and that was eventually moved. So it was a very heightened issue at the time. And the end result was that, funny enough, that the actual diplomatic note that was to be sent wouldn't really have asked the incoming boats to even declare what they had on board. So it really was whipped up in many respects. But I think one of the interesting issues about that is that the zero-tolerance policy also seems to have been done in 1988. And what's interesting about that, though, is that we can't find any minutes publicly on it. So the Joint Parliamentary Committee for Greenland in 1988 supposedly actually had agreed to a policy that they would not mine radioactive elements higher than background levels. Clearly, though, this is a policy, not a law, so it can be changed at the political level. So in practice, it should be not more than 60 grams of uranium per ton of rock, or 60 parts per million. That means that should not be blasted, or that would actually go above the zero-tolerance policy. So the current political debate is that we don't change the policy. It's been there for 25 years. Or we allow uranium as a byproduct, or allow uranium production, which for me, 2 and 3 seem to be the same thing. But it's down here in Kvanefjeld where this issue really becomes, because they have 575 million pounds of uranium. They also have 10 million pounds of rare earth. So the rare earth is potentially one of the largest reserves of rare earth, and this could also break the Chinese monopoly. So to be able to get to the rare earth, you have to blast the uranium. And if you're blasting, then you're going above the zero-tolerance policy, so the zero-tolerance policy would have to be in some way shifted, lifted, or altered to be able to accommodate either as a byproduct or allowing uranium as well to be able to be exported. As you can see, though, there are also other uranium-bearing occurrences within Greenland, particularly those that are known are the ones in the south and then in the east. But what I also find, I'll just give you another shot of this. But as you can see here, Greenland actually has everything. It has gold, copper, uranium, rare earth, iron, diamonds, oil off its shores. So within this context, uranium is very much mixed in to everything. And so within these, you can see the different occurrences. Kvanefjeld is the only one that has been fully explored, because that's the one that was given a political exemption to be able to explore. The zero-tolerance policy did not even allow exploration. And one of the things that I find interesting up here, this is where Tula is, we actually have the potential for Canadian-grade uranium. It's similar to the Athabasca Basin.
Where is that?
Up here. Tula's up here. Now, of course, it's a little bit harder to mine up here than it is down here. Narsak, which is the town that's right beside Kvanefjeld, it has a port which is open all year round. This is where climate change is actually pushing the development of natural resources on the island. So here's another shot of Kvanefjeld and what it has, potentially the 5th largest reserves. According to the Bureau of Mining and Petroleum, or BMP, in Denmark, it's about 150 parts per million of yellowcake. According to industry, it can go up to 350 parts per million. So it's a pretty good grade. Olympic Dam is the one here that we have, which is the highest, and then so Kvanefjeld potentially the 5th largest. So there's a lot of money to be made there. And certainly, whether it's a byproduct or not, it's certainly a big part of the product that comes out of Kvanefjeld. And then just to make things a little bit more complex, when you're talking about lifting the zero-tolerance policy, even though the 2009 Self-Government Act gave Greenland full authority over its natural resources, Denmark is still responsible for foreign defense, security, monetary, immigration policy. So within this context, we get a little bit of both sides have to be engaged in this issue if the zero tolerance policy is to be lifted. So Denmark also is a part of the EU, but Greenland is not. Greenland is the only territory that has actually left the EU, and it did that in 1985 after a referendum. But they are considered European Union citizens. They are what the EU calls one of its overseas countries and territories. So it has a special relationship with the EU, and also through its metropole, Copenhagen. What becomes interesting here, though, is that because Denmark is part of the EU, it's also part of Euratom. So when Greenland left the EU, it also left Euratom. So are these issues of how would it work with reporting from Copenhagen to Luxembourg, and then from Copenhagen to Vienna to the IAEA? These things will have to be worked out practically, but in terms of Euratom, it is clear that if Denmark is to do its reporting for Greenland through directly to the IAEA, that will not be a problem for the relationship. But the EU, or in terms of Euratom, actually has a lot to offer in terms of legislative help to both Denmark and Greenland if they should decide to export uranium. The other thing is that export controls from Copenhagen or for Copenhagen actually come from Brussels, anything to do with the dual-use export side. And since Greenland is not part of the EU, they'll probably have to develop their own and start that from scratch. Same thing with NSG Zanger. Denmark is a member of both. So would someone from Greenland then come in, sit beside them? How is that relationship going to work in terms of the nuclear suppliers group in Zanger and export control regimes? And then just to give you another sense of the mixed legislation that's in place when it comes to nuclear activities. When Greenland left the EU and Euratom, it actually went back to the old agreement that Denmark had in CIRC 176. It's really old. And when I mention that number, most people don't know that number. So it's essentially the same thing in many respects, what Denmark has with as being a member of Euratom in CIRC 193. But Greenland is not a party to the additional protocol. But Denmark is. And again, Denmark, right after the additional protocol came out, was out there in 1998 to ratify it. But the good news is, see the note on the side, is that the additional protocol is actually going to be signed this month by Amano and by the Danes, and finally it will actually be enforced for Greenland. So this is a huge, huge development. When it comes to the rest of the conventions, you can see Denmark is a party to them all, the Faroe Islands and Greenland are not. Now, in many respects, you can make the argument if they only have seafood and no dual use, then what would they need any of these for? But I think also what, particularly from the IAEA perspective, when it came to the additional protocol, hopefully up until only this month, has been talking a lot about it would be great if Denmark could actually kind of clean up its safeguards because it's not clear to us how it works. Why one part of a kingdom has it and another part doesn't. And the Netherlands is actually the same as well when it comes to its overseas countries and territories. Then there's another issue if you are a newbie, potentially to the nuclear fuel cycle, and that's the international governance, or the lack thereof, when it comes to Yellowcake in general. So natural uranium is considered source material under the IAEA statute, but it is not covered by the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement. So it's only with the additional protocol that we actually get the full picture of the nuclear fuel cycle, from mining all the way to the very end. But again, it's not full accountancy. You do have to provide documentation or reporting about the concentration of your mines, how much production are you going to have, and then more specifically when it comes to the NSG and the Convention on the Prevention of Protection of Physical Material. For there, the reporting is anything over 500 kilograms that is exported needs to be notified. So in many respects, when it comes to the limited governance, if you are a newbie coming to the field, there's really no place to go to be able to get a sense of international best practices and governance that can actually help to guide you. So you're very much, in many respects, left on your own if you want to make sure that what you're shipping off is not going to be going to, one, a nuclear weapons program, or also potentially diverted. So that brings us to the elections. Obviously, mining has been a big part of the debate over the past few weeks, actually for the past 3 years since the 2009 Self-Government Act. I can never say it right, Inatsisartut, or Landsting in Danish, the Greenlandic Parliament, and it has 31 seats. As you can see, there they are. Yeah. And 11, actually, as of yesterday, were women, which is, I think, about 34%. So you need 16 seats for a majority. And up until this point, there was a coalition that was headed by Kuupik Kleist of IA, or the Community of the Peoples. And they lost. IA? I haven't said actually how much they had. Yeah. Just trying to remember how much he won from before. So they actually had 14 seats up until yesterday. And so they had a coalition with the Democrats and another smaller party. And so they've lost. And what basically the real head-to-head fight, and it was actually extremely close, was between Alexa Hammond and, this is Kuupik Kleist of IA. And she is from Siumut. And Siumut is the party that actually held power in Greenland for 30 years, since 1978. They lost it to IA in 2009, when the last elections were held. So she actually, last night, won 42.8% of the vote. So still not a majority, not 16 seats, but it is 14 seats. So she is the one that is going to be deciding, or hopefully trying to form a coalition. The other partners potentially, I wish I could say who they could be, but it really depends on what, how they're going to agree on different aspects. There was actually one idea that was floated past that perhaps IA and Siumut would actually do a coalition together. But they have very different of opinions when it comes to what we call the big scale law. Siumut, for example, wants to start charging royalties and taxes on mining industries right from day one, before they even take anything out of the ground. Whereas IA, with the big scale law, was actually saying that not until they start producing will we start taxing. Siumut also has been very clear all the way through that they want to mine everything, including uranium. IA has been more split, and both, however, do say that they're not going to start mining uranium until the environmental and the health and safety aspects are fully studied. And that study should be coming out sometime this spring. So we do have a shift in government, but not necessarily going back to the way it was for 30 years before. But we do have a new, and by the way, this is the first female head of government for Greenland. And so also with the first female prime minister in Denmark, we could have a very interesting next few years coming up ahead. There's also one new party that actually was established this year in Greenland. So we had 5 parties in the Greenland Parliament up until yesterday, and we will have 5 again tomorrow, but one of the oldies will be dropped, and the new party called Party Inuit will be in. I don't know enough about them to actually say what their positions are on uranium. I looked at it. Doesn't seem to be anything explicitly said yet. So there could be potentially a coalition there. They won 2 mandates last night. And so in total with IA, they won 11 mandates, and Siumut won 14. The Democrats, which is a social liberal, won 2. And the Alisat, or the Solidarity Party, which is center-right, won 2 as well. And then the new party won 2. So that's the breakdown. So any questions?
Cindy, I know, but I don't quite understand. So these are the 2 who
Identify yourself because we're webcasting.
Oh, Stephanie Cook.
And they use the, yeah.
Sorry, Stephanie Cook.
Stephanie Cook from Nuclear Intelligence Weekly. I had one question, which is, could you explain what the major difference between the IA and the Siumut is in terms of sort of just comparing with our political parties, or is that not not possible?
I mean, I think the thing always to remember is that when you're talking about Scandinavia in general, you are talking more on the social side of things. So even if they're right, they're still left, I think is the best way to put it. Both of these, Siumut has been described as a center party. So again, that would still be far more left than you would consider here. And then IA would be the left of center. The new party, Inuit, they said that they are right of IA, so maybe between these two, but I'm not quite sure how that works.
But just to clarify, though, but the IA is split over whether to allow uranium to come out of the ground or
Right.
to be processed into uranium.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Do we have a...
Yeah.
Find the microphone.
My question to me was on the Danish politics. Miles Pomper from Center for Nonproliferation Studies. I mean, I understand your zero tolerance, but that obviously applies to, I mean, the origin you seem to indicate had to do with nuclear weapons, that this was out of the weapons. Is there a distinction at all in Danish politics about, okay, this is uranium that would be for civil use, not for weapons, or anyone trying to make that kind of argument?
Sure, definitely. And in fact, that's made by Greenland, those who are in support of lifting the policy all the time. So if other countries like Canada and Australia are able to ship off for civilian uses, why can't we? The debate then, though, comes down to the types of conditions of supply that would have to be put into place. And understanding that as soon as you start shipping it off, you do need to have a specific regulatory system in place to be able to inspire confidence that actually where you're shipping it to does go to civilian purposes and not any way diverted or used for nuclear weapons. So that's part of the issue. And because you can never be 100% assured of that, that also comes very much to the heart, I think, of many Danes and Greenlanders in that way, because of their history. And actually, it was Niels Bohr who first found Kvanefjeld in the 1950s. And he wanted to use it initially for energy purposes in Denmark, wanted to build nuclear power plants. But the costs in and of themselves, I think, was a huge reason as not to. So it wasn't just because of the technology itself, but also the huge amount of costs for such a small population.
I'd like to just exercise the prerogative of the chair for a minute and put you on the spot, Cindy. These election results, do you believe that the CSIS coalition, once it's formed, would be more likely to lift the zero tolerance party and policy, and for primarily economic reasons or political reasons, or
economic? Because of Kvanefjeld itself, if you actually want to mine the rare earth, you have to mine the uranium. And the idea of putting it in a pile, for example, putting 575 million pounds of rock, of uranium, somewhere else and then not export it actually is not economically viable in that way. And then you still have to have a set of regulatory legislation and policies in place for that pile, no matter what. So Greenland has to be able to, and Denmark have to be able to work together to figure out what type of regulatory system they're going to be putting into place. And I think that CSIS is more ready to move on that quite quickly.
Can I follow up? So the driver would be more on the rare earth elements end of it than the uranium part of it. And one more question, then we'll move to other folks. In this paper that we handed out that was just published, the EU non-proliferation papers, you go into some of the issues or challenges in harmonizing the EU's non-proliferation policies. So could you talk just a little bit about how either your recommendations for how they do that or what some of the drawbacks to the current system are?
The EU, the WMD strategy that they had come out with, gosh, that's 10 years now, 10 years ago. That policy was very, I don't know if you'd say it was clear, but it was certainly provided a framework for EU action when it comes to non-proliferation and disarmament. One of the problems with that policy, though, however, it was trying to get it more mainstreamed into every activity that the EU would do, particularly when it came to its trade agreements. But when it comes to its arrangements with the overseas countries and territories, that part seemed to be completely left out. And the argument that I make in the paper is that if you want to modernize and develop your overseas countries and territories, or OCTs, and the relationship with the EU, you have to also address these aspects, because we're talking about more and more trade with these islands that are abroad. 27 of them, I think it is. 24. And in terms of Greenland, this is one of the things that I think is quite shocking in the sense that you can see where the development was going, and yet still when it came to the redoing or relooking, renegotiating the agreement with the EU and Greenland, this was still not on the agenda. So the EU non-proliferation strategy is still not entirely within every aspect, certainly, of its trade agreements, and they're also applied kind of differently to different agreements as well. Community agreements, for example, versus specific trade agreements, other outside trade agreements. So in this way, and there is money also when it comes to the non-proliferation policies of the EU, and that can be used for education and dual-use exports, in understanding export controls, and also proliferation networks, which I think if you're a potential newbie to the fuel cycle is extremely important to have.
Hi, this is Timothy Westmeyer with GW and the Rising Powers Initiative. Are there any particular countries you have on your mind that would be very excited about the election results? Potential buyers that want to line up ahead of time for either the rare earth or but more in terms of the uranium side? Thank you.
Well, rare earth, I think that a lot of countries are hoping to break the monopoly that China has. And so Greenland in that way could be a new one. But there's also a new rare earth mine found in the Philippines, was it not? And then I think there's one here in the United States as well. But at the same time, you have to remember that China is the only place you can actually refine the rare earths. So at the end of the day, it still needs to go back to China before it's shipped out again. In terms of the uranium specifically, the idea of Arctic Yellowcake, I think, for many different countries is probably enticing. To be able to go in, and also given its proximity to the United States, to Europe, in that way, I think it could be quite interesting for them. China seems, I haven't read too much about China looking at uranium from Greenland. They're more interested in the iron and the aluminum and all the other minerals. Rare, I don't know if they're interested in the rare earth. They haven't made a play for it. I think that's also because it would be competition. But in terms of uranium itself, I wouldn't know of any country who wouldn't be interested.
Hi, Stephen Knight, State Department, Office of the Coordinator for Threat Reduction Programs. Could you just put this issue in context of Greenland's overall politics? How big of an issue is it? How much of a driver is it? How much was it discussed in this campaign and so forth?
Poverty, education, and mining were basically the top three issues in lead up, and still are in the debate. And uranium seems to kind of ebb and flow specifically, but it's more because they have everything. Mining is the big issue, and how to go about doing that development in a smart, pragmatic way. And I can tell you, most officials that I talk to, Greenlandic and Danish, are very sober in their discussions about this and how to be able to take a step-by-step process. Independence is also an issue, not just in terms of securing more autonomy from Copenhagen, but also in terms of eventually being able to sustain themselves as their own country. Again, those discussions are quite sober. None of the politicians that I talk to, even if maybe a little nationalism was whipped up in lead up to the elections, know that this would take 20, 30, 40 years. And this is also the big push for the development of natural resources to be able to eventually stand on their own feet, wean themselves from the Danish subsidies.
This discovering the abundance of uranium, is it a recent event or has there been always a case? If it has been the case, why is it an issue right now, or the concern or excitement?
Niels Bohr actually had found uranium in 1950s, and there were some, 1955 I think it was, and there were some tests that were actually done at the Risø research reactor. So that there are uranium tailings in Denmark, actually, as a result of these tests. But then again, the decision not to go for nuclear energy, so the whole idea basically died. And then the zero tolerance policy in 1988. But the reason why it's become such an issue now is, one, climate change. Things are melting. There is an ability to actually go in and mine in Greenland a lot cheaper than you could have 20, 30 years ago. And also because of the 2009 Act, Self-Government Act, which gave Greenland its authorities over its natural resources. So, and then the rare earth potential, and then the byproduct that is sitting there with it.
Thank you. Ambassador Maman Sidiko of Niger Republic. Very far from...
Yes. A little warmer, too.
One time, Minister of Foreign Affairs, I remember when I met folks from, not Greenland, but Denmark, it was about transparent ballot boxes. It was about elections. So it's great that we talk about uranium now, but it's something that, Niger produces as well. I was just wondering, cooperation-wise, whether beyond discussing with EU, etc., you also interacting with other producing countries, Australia, Canada, not to mention Niger.
Right.
Thank you.
This is something that's a slow process. We're first starting with the additional protocol, getting that in place. And actually with the project that, the reason why I'm here and from MacArthur funding is to be able to look at the best practices in actually up to 17 countries. So we have 25 researchers looking at the security safeguards and safety aspects, the governance issues, and its implementation in these 17 countries, to be able to get a sense and a snapshot that can feed into these newbies, like Greenland. So, for example, when mentioning this to both Greenland and Denmark, there's a little sigh of relief that, oh, thank God, there is someone at least is looking at this aspect. From their perspective, because of their limited resources, they first need to figure out communications framework for discussion, how practicalities of the legality issues and reporting to the IAEA, Euratom, all these other kinds of things. And then I think it also becomes if they're going to lift the zero tolerance policy, then there has to be direct contact with Canada and Australia first. And that seems to be the sense, because they have, one, proximity in terms of Canada and experience with Arctic mining, but also in terms of their longevity when it comes to looking at safety, security, and safeguards. But other producers, definitely. Yeah.
Cindy, Stephanie Cook from Nuclear Intelligence Weekly. I have two very sort of separate questions. One on the safeguards and working out our new regulatory system. How do you sort of build into this system the eventuality that Greenland would become an independent country and keep, for example, the additional protocol if they agreed to sign it? And is there an effort underway to get them to sign the additional protocol? I'll leave it at that for now. I wanted to ask you about the northern part of the island too, in terms of how much production might come. Is there a lot of activity up there in terms of uranium production?
On the safeguards aspect, the additional protocol, as soon as it's signed by Amano and the Danes this month, then it will be in force for Greenland. So it is going to happen. Yeah, it is going to happen. It's not a political issue in terms, or contentious for them not to have it. It's just a matter of getting everything in place. And in terms of the north, that isn't explored. So there is a sense of what the geology is, but actually how much is there is not sure.
It's not explored. Okay.
Can we come back to the map?
Mm-hmm. That one?
So I think it's hard for everybody to see. Can you just walk through the colors?
Yeah. So the blue has uranium, right? These are pretty clear. This is Kvanefjeld down here. This is Greenland, which is another rare earth deposit here, which actually very low concentrations of uranium, but still uranium. I think it's about 50 parts per million. It is actually quite low, potentially even lower than background levels. So you can see up here the blue, and this is based on the geology, which is very similar to the Athabasca Basin in that way. And there's another geology term that they use as well that I can't remember. And then the yellow might have, but they're not sure yet. So it's everywhere. And then who knows what's underneath.
But this is also, as uranium economics go, right? The higher the price goes, the more uranium you discover. And so I wonder, how were these estimates or when you look at the OECD Red Book on uranium, there's, reasonably recoverable resources, and then there are different prices attached to it. Do we have any sense of...
Greenland hasn't made it to the Red Book.
Okay. And then my...
So this is from the Geology Institute in Copenhagen for Greenland and Denmark, and also from the Bureau of Mining and Petroleum in Greenland.
And then to put this in the context of the global uranium resources, where would Greenland rank? I mean, since we don't know exactly what they have, it's hard to say, but any kind of estimate there?
And it always becomes hard because when you read a lot of industry magazines, they always say that it's the world's largest, right, reserve, or the third largest, fourth largest. So with Kvanefjeld, with 575 million pounds, it does seem to be potentially the fifth. So when we talk about Greenland and its potential, it's fifth and higher. Niger is fourth.
Yeah, well, maybe first, second by 2016 if his gut doesn't go fast.
Right. Yeah, sorry.
Do we have other questions?
I should also just say on one thing here that one of the things that seems to be a global experience that if you're starting from scratch, it's usually 5 years to build a regulatory system. So there is time, and it does need to be done step by step in this way. You just can't lift the zero tolerance policy and not have anything to actually guide industry. And in Scandinavia, I mean, this is Scandinavia. They love their norms, legal legislation aspects, and they want to follow them. So in this way, it is something that needs to be thought about together with Copenhagen. And by the way, the capital, haven't you even said it yet, the capital of Copenhagen is Nuuk. I recognize in this lingo, it's of Greenland, sorry, yeah. So, but in Greenlandic, it means Cape. So it's not the same as we would consider it. But there needs to be, the first thing that really has to happen is Copenhagen and Nuuk to be able to come together to figure out how much resources are they going to be able to need to be able to, one, develop the policy and then to implement it. And if it's going to take 5 years, that rare earth is not going to be able to be moved out of there until that policy is put into place.
But there are discussions underway.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But now with this new government, they have to kind of start anew or...
Well, and the big thing immediately is the big scale law. That is the big thing. So the Greenlandic Parliament had passed that back in December. The Danish Parliament has to also pass that. But because CSIS, it has been clear that it actually has a difference of opinion with IA on the big scale law. I'm not sure what's going to happen with that. This is the one that deals specifically with big investments, mining investments, and bringing in foreign labor into Greenland. The big scale law basically says that if you invest a certain amount, I can't remember what amount it is, it's huge, that you can actually bring in foreign workers and pay them at a lower level than you would Greenlandic or Danish workers. So obviously that's a highly sensitive issue for the kingdom.
And what's the CSIS differences over that?
They want to start taxing right away, whereas IA wanted to wait until they were in production or at least profitable, I think. But I'm not exactly clear on that.
And they have to agree with Denmark on this?
Yes. Both sides need to pass.
Basically. And how long is it going to take Denmark to pass this law?
Well, they should be doing it this spring. But again, if CSIS or the coalition that comes into place is going to challenge it, then maybe that'll take a little bit longer.
I see. And does Denmark get some of the tax money?
I have no idea all the benefits when it comes to the big scale law.
Okay, so CSIS could challenge the law that Denmark is hoping...
No, that Greenland has already passed.
Greenland's passed, but
Denmark has yet to pass, yeah.
And no production can take place till all of that's done?
No, that's not true. The iron is going through. It's more on the investment and the taxation, the royalty side. I'm actually not quite sure how it works with, again, I'm not an extractive industry expert. I'm only focusing on the uranium. So I shouldn't say anything about...
You're going ahead with the mine right now?
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
And Cindy, looking into the future, how might mining compare to fishing in Greenland? Could it become more important or
No idea. This was actually one of the things I was reading about in lead up to the during the elections here was a lot of the people within the fishing industry were saying, yeah, there's a lot of focus on mining, but we still have issues with fishing. So there has to be able to strike a balance. How much? I mean, who knows? I'm assuming it will go beyond the 10% exports of metals that they currently have. But how much, I don't know.
Other questions, sir?
Interesting. Is there any no production because of resistance to nuclear energy or to what happened in the past because of what went down in the waters? And any future quote-unquote green party or green movement and say, here, no nuclear period, like in Japan we're seeing now?
Right. I think that what you'll find across the kingdom is everyone's green. And particularly the health and safety aspects have actually been what has guided policy and legislation in Denmark all the way through. Since the X-ray law was first done in 1930. So all the way through, that has really been the main focus, and it's always been on the effects on the population and the environment that they've been looking at, more so than on the proliferation side. It's always been on the human element and environmental one. So I think that is what guides it, and this is where the debate really is centered, mostly on, because you have to, actually one of the things I should mention is that Greenland, particularly around Narsak, which is the town by Kvanefjeld, already has extremely high levels of background radioactivity. So it's something that is at the heart of many of the townspeople that live in that area. Now, then again, you also have to remember, Narsak, there are a lot of buildings that are completely abandoned. Poverty is actually quite is growing there. So, as I understand, the people of Narsak do want to mine, and that's because of the unemployment issue. But in terms of, I think it's generally more really the health and safety. The proliferation aspect just adds this other, what would you say, caution from the side of both the Danes and the Greenlanders.
One thing I think that we've learned as we're looking at uranium mining in the U.S. is that the safety issues, the health and safety issues, play a very prominent role in that in some towns where you had uranium mining practically downtown, or whether it was the milling, there were some significant environmental hazards. It's too early a stage now with Greenland, but could you talk about, different, would they be more likely to go towards in situ leaching?
Kvanefjeld is open pit.
It's open pit.
Yeah, Kvanefjeld is open pit. I don't know how it would work with the others, but again, with the driving force being this very sensitive Arctic environment, I actually am quite what's the word? Confident, I guess, actually, that what the Greenlanders and the Danes will do, I suspect that should the zero tolerance policy be lifted, you will find quite stringent environmental safety standards that will be put in place. That I would definitely expect.
All right, I just have one last question. I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about what the IAEA is doing in terms of studying uranium and nuclear security, because you've been involved in some of those efforts.
The IAEA has been looking at particularly INFCIRC 225 Rev 5, which is nuclear security, basically, practice. In that guidance, it talks about prudent management practice, but it actually does not elaborate on it. So the IAEA has been looking at how to elaborate or provide something, some type of guidance for states, particularly, again, newbie states, who are coming in and looking at how do we make sure that what we are producing and what we're shipping is done in a way that is secure, and making sure, and particularly within the exports and the transport side of things. The transport is, as usual, usually the gap. So that actually has put forward a draft document which will be put forward for internal review by the IAEA, and maybe it'll be done before the Nuclear Security Summit, maybe not. But that is actually a huge step forward for the IAEA in actually starting to look more at the front end of the fuel cycle, particularly up until the point of conversion, and to be able to provide this guidance to states. Again, if you're Malawi, Tanzania, Greenland, and potentially thinking about this, it serves as a useful guide.
So thank you. So and when I think about Greenland and the number of people there, and it being an island, I mean, it could be, if it goes forward with uranium mining, probably one of the more secure places
right, it is an island.
on the planet against any, because you could imagine it's not going to really be a transit point
no.
for nuclear terrorists.
But I think one of the things that, well, it's not just about terrorism, it's also about state-to-state proliferation, right? And I think one of the things that particularly in this field that we understand is that how you think things are going to work in the future might not actually turn out that way. And particularly if this becomes a pool in 30, 40, or whatever years, maybe even quicker. Last year, I think the sea ice actually surpassed its the lowest point it's ever gone, and surpassed it by 500,000 square kilometers. So this is actually becoming a very different environment, which of course is bringing in more boats, more tourism, all these other things. So it is shifting. And I think that's one of the things that, yes, thankfully it is on an island, but it is shifting in terms of how this island is interacting with its environment and the other countries are interacting within that.
All right, well, please join me in thanking Cindy for...
Thanks.
And stay tuned for more research and work on uranium from the Danish Institute for International